Introduction completed. 100 XP 3 minutes. Creating administration scripts is a powerful way to optimize your workflow. You can automate common, repetitive tasks. Once a script has been verified, it will run consistently, likely reducing errors. Suppose you work at a company that uses Azure Virtual Machines, VMs, to test your customer relationship management, CRM, software. The VMs are built from images that include a web front-end, a web service that implements business logic, and an SQL database. You've been executing multiple rounds of tests on a single VM, but you've noticed that changes in the database and configuration files can cause inconsistent results. In one case, a bug created a phone call record with no corresponding customer in the database. The orphaned record caused subsequent integration tests to fail, even after you fixed the bug. You plan to solve this problem by using a fresh VM deployment for each testing cycle. You want to automate the VM creation setup because it will be executed many times per week. Here, you'll learn how to manage Azure resources using Azure PowerShell. You'll use Azure PowerShell interactively for one-off tasks, and write scripts to automate repeated tasks. Learning objectives. In this module, you will decide if Azure PowerShell is the right tool for your Azure administration tasks. Install Azure PowerShell on Linux, Mac OS, and / or Windows. Connect to an Azure subscription using Azure PowerShell. Create Azure resources using Azure PowerShell. Prerequisites. Experience with a command line interface such as PowerShell or Bash. Knowledge of basic Azure concepts such as resource groups and virtual machines. Experience administering Azure resources using the Azure portal. Decide if Azure PowerShell is right for your tasks. Completed. 100 XP 5 minutes. Suppose you need to choose a tool to administer the Azure resources you'll use to test your customer relationship management, CRM, system. Your tests require you to create resource groups and provision virtual machines, VMs. You want something that is easy for administrators to learn, but powerful enough to automate the installation and setup of multiple virtual machines, or script a full application environment. There are multiple tools available, and you need to find the best one for your people and tasks. What tools are available? Azure provides 3 administration tools: the Azure Portal, the Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell. They all offer approximately the same amount of control. Any task that you can do with one of the tools, you can likely do with the other 2. All 3 are cross-platform, running on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. They differ in syntax, setup requirements, automation support. Here, we'll describe each of the 3 options and provide some guidance on how to decide among them. What is the Azure Portal? The Azure Portal is a website that lets you create, configure, and alter the resources in your Azure subscription. The portal is a graphical user interface, GUI, that makes it convenient to locate the resource you need and execute any required changes. It also guides you through complex administrative tasks by providing wizards and tooltips. The portal doesn't provide any way to automate repetitive tasks. For example, to set up 15 VMs, you would need to create them one by one, completing the wizard for each VM. This method can be time-consuming, and is error-prone for complex tasks. What is the Azure CLI? The Azure CLI is a cross-platform command line program to connect to Azure and execute administrative commands on Azure resources. For example, to create a VM, you could use the following command. The Azure CLI is available 2 ways: inside a browser via the Azure Cloud Shell, or with a local install on Linux, Mac, or Windows. In both cases, you can use it interactively, or use it with scripts to automate tasks. For interactive use, you'd first launch a shell such as cmd.exe on Windows, or Bash on Linux or Mac OS, then issue the commands at the shell prompt. To automate repetitive tasks, you'd assemble the commands into a shell script using the script syntax of your chosen shell, then execute the script. What is Azure PowerShell? Azure PowerShell is a module you add to PowerShell to let you connect to your Azure subscription and manage resources. Azure PowerShell requires PowerShell to function. PowerShell provides services like the shell window, command parsing, and so on. The Azure AZ PowerShell module adds Azure-specific commands. For example, Azure PowerShell provides the new ASVM command, which creates a virtual machine for you in your Azure subscription. To use it, you would launch the PowerShell application, then issue the following command. Azure PowerShell is also available two ways, inside a browser via the Azure Cloud Shell, or with a local install on Linux, Mac, or Windows. In both cases, you have two modes to choose from. You can use it in interactive mode, in which you manually issue one command at a time. Or, in scripting mode, where you execute a script that consists of multiple commands. How to choose an administrative tool? There's approximate parity between the portal, the Azure CLI, and Azure PowerShell with respect to the Azure objects they can administer and the configurations they can create. They are also all cross-platform. Typically, you'll consider several other factors when making your choice. Automation. Do you need to automate a set of complex or repetitive tasks? Azure PowerShell and the Azure CLI support automation, while Azure Portal doesn't. Learning curve. Do you need to complete a task quickly without learning new commands or syntax? The Azure Portal doesn't require you to learn syntax or memorize commands. In Azure PowerShell and the Azure CLI, you must know the detailed syntax for each command you use. Team skill set. Does your team have existing expertise? For example, your team may have used PowerShell to administer Windows. If so, they'll quickly become comfortable using Azure PowerShell. Example: recall that you're choosing an administrative tool to create the test environments for your CRM application. Your administrators have two specific Azure tasks they need to complete. Create one resource group for each category of testing, unit, integration, and acceptance. Create multiple VMs in each resource group before every round of testing. To create the resource groups, the Azure Portal is a reasonable choice. These tasks are one-offs, so you don't need scripts to complete them. Finding the best tool to create the VMs is a more challenging decision. You need to create several VMs, and you need to create them repeatedly, likely several times each week. For these tasks, you'll want automation, so the Azure Portal isn't a good choice. In this case, either Azure PowerShell or the Azure CLI will meet your needs. If your team members have some existing PowerShell knowledge, Azure PowerShell will likely be the best match. Azure PowerShell is available on the operating systems your admin team uses. It supports automation, and should be quick for your team to learn. Most administrators' first experience with Azure is in the portal. It's a great place to start as it provides a clean, well-structured graphical interface, but provides limited options for automation. When you need automation, Azure gives you two options: Azure PowerShell for admins with PowerShell experience and the Azure CLI for everyone else. In practice, businesses typically have a mix of one-off and repetitive tasks. So, it's common to use both the portal and a scripting solution. In our CRM example, it's appropriate to create the resource groups via the portal and automate the VM creation with PowerShell. The rest of this module focuses on installing and using Azure PowerShell. Install PowerShell completed 100 XP 10 minutes. Suppose you've chosen Azure PowerShell as your automation solution. Your administrators prefer to run their scripts locally rather than in the Azure Cloud Shell. The team uses machines that run Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. You need to get Azure PowerShell working on all their devices. What must be installed? We'll go through the actual installation instructions in the next unit, but let's look at the two components that make up Azure PowerShell. The base PowerShell product. This comes in two variants, Windows PowerShell and PowerShell 7.x, which can be installed on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. The Azure AZ PowerShell module. This extra module must be installed to add the Azure-specific commands to PowerShell. PowerShell 7.0.6 LTS, PowerShell 7.1.3, or higher is the recommended version of PowerShell for use with the Azure AZ PowerShell module on all platforms. This exercise guides you through creating a local installation of PowerShell tools. The remainder of this module uses the Azure Cloud Shell, so you can leverage the free subscription support in Microsoft Learn. If you prefer, consider this exercise as an optional activity and just review the instructions. Windows PowerShell is included with the Windows operating system. However, we recommend installing PowerShell 7.0.6 LTS, PowerShell 7.1.3, or higher for use with Azure AZ PowerShell module PowerShell. You can check which version is installed using the following steps. In the system tray search box, type PowerShell. You may have multiple shortcut links. PowerShell 7, x64, the 64-bit version. Generally, you should choose this shortcut. Windows PowerShell, the 64-bit version included with Windows. Windows PowerShell, x86, a 32-bit version installed on 64-bit Windows. Windows PowerShell ISE, the integrated scripting environment, ISE, is used for writing scripts in Windows PowerShell. Windows PowerShell ISE, x86, a 32-bit version of the ISE on Windows. Select the best match PowerShell icon. Type the following command to determine the version of PowerShell installed. After the .NET tool is installed, run the PowerShell version command again to verify your installation. You'll also need to set up your local machine, to support PowerShell. In the next unit, we'll review commands you can add, including the Azure AZ PowerShell module. In interactive mode, PowerShell lets you write commands and execute them immediately. Recall that the overall goal in the Customer Relationship Management (CRM) example is to create 3 test environments containing virtual machines. You use resource groups to ensure the VMs are organized into separate environments, one for unit testing, one for integration testing, and one for acceptance testing. You only need to create the resource groups once, so using the PowerShell interactive mode in this use case is a good choice. When you enter a command into PowerShell, PowerShell matches the command to a command, and PowerShell then performs the requested action. First, we look at some common commands you can use, then we look into installing the Azure support for PowerShell. What are PowerShell commands? A PowerShell command is called a command, pronounced commandlet. A command is a command that manipulates a single feature. The term command is intended to imply small command. By convention, command authors are encouraged to keep commands simple and single-purpose. The base PowerShell product ships with commands that work with features such as sessions and background jobs. You can add modules to your PowerShell installation to get commands that manipulate other features. For example, there are third-party modules to work with FTP, administer your operating system, access the file system, and so on. Commands follow a verb-noun naming convention, for example, get process, format table, and start service. There's also a convention for verb choice, get to retrieve data, set to insert or update data, format to format data, out to direct output to a destination, and so on. Command authors are encouraged to include a help file for each command. The get help command displays the help file for any command. For example, to get help on the get child item command, enter the following statement in a Windows PowerShell session. What is a PowerShell module? Commands are shipped in modules. A PowerShell module is a DLL that includes the code to process each available command. You load commands into PowerShell by loading the module in which they are contained. You can get a list of loaded modules using the get module command. What is the AZ PowerShell module? AZ is the formal name for the Azure PowerShell module, which contains commands to work with Azure features. It contains hundreds of commands that let you control nearly every aspect of every Azure resource. You can work with resource groups, storage, virtual machines, Azure Active Directory, containers, machine learning, and so on. The AZ module is an open source component available on GitHub. You might have seen or used Azure PowerShell commands that used a Azure RM format. Because AZ PowerShell modules now have all the capabilities of Azure RM PowerShell modules and more, we'll retire Azure RM PowerShell modules on the 29th of February, 2024. To avoid service interruptions, update your scripts that use Azure RM PowerShell modules to use AZ PowerShell modules by the 29th of February, 2024. To automatically update your scripts, follow the Quick Start Guide. Install the AZ PowerShell module. The AZ PowerShell module is available from a global repository called the PowerShell Gallery. You can install the module onto your local machine through the Install Module command. To install the latest Azure AZ PowerShell module, run the following commands. Open the Start menu and enter PowerShell. Select the PowerShell icon. Enter the following command, and then press Enter. The previous command installs the module for your current user, controlled by the scope parameter. The command relies on NuGet to retrieve components. So depending on the version you've installed, you might be prompted to download and install the latest version of NuGet. Enter Y and press Enter. By default, the PowerShell Gallery isn't configured as a trusted repository for PowerShell Get. Each time you perform an installation from an untrusted repository, you're prompted to confirm you want to install the module with following output. Script execution failed. Depending on your security configuration, import module might fail with something like the following output. It might also fail by not responding at all. In this case, press Ctrl and C to stop the program. Both behaviors typically indicate that the execution policy is restricted, meaning you can't run modules that you download from an external source, including the PowerShell Gallery. You can check by running the command get execution policy. If it returns restricted, then Use the Set Execution Policy command to change the policy to remote signed. You're prompted for permission. Update a PowerShell module. You may get a warning or error message that indicates a version of the Azure PowerShell module is already installed. If so, you can issue the following command to update to the latest version. As with the install module command, answer yes or yes to all when prompted to trust the module. You can also use the update module command to reinstall a module if you're having trouble with it. Example, how to create a resource group with Azure PowerShell. Once you've installed the Azure module, you can begin working with Azure. Let's do a common task, creating a resource group. As you know, we use resource groups to administer related resources together. Creating a new resource group is one of the first tasks you do when starting a new Azure solution. There are 4 steps you need to perform. Import the Azure conduits. Connect to your Azure subscription. Create the resource group. Verify that creation was successful. The following illustration shows an overview of these steps. Each step corresponds to a different conduit. Import the Azure conduits. Beginning with PowerShell 3.0, modules are loaded automatically when you use a conduit within the module. It's no longer necessary to manually import PowerShell modules unless you've changed the default module autoloading settings. Connect when you're working with a local install of Azure PowerShell. You need to authenticate before you can execute Azure commands. The Connect has account controlled prompts for your Azure credentials, then connects to your Azure subscription. It has many optional parameters, but if all you need is an interactive prompt, you don't need any parameters. Work with subscriptions. If you're new to Azure, you probably only have a single subscription. But if you've been using Azure for a while, you might have created multiple Azure subscriptions. You can configure Azure PowerShell to execute commands against a particular subscription. You can only be in one subscription at a time. Use the Get As context control to determine which subscription is active. If it's not the correct one, you can change subscriptions using another control. Get a list of all subscription names in your account with the Get As subscription command. Change the subscription by passing the name of the one to select. If you need to look up the subscription ID, open Azure and select Subscriptions on the home page. Get a list of all resource groups. You can retrieve a list of all resource groups in the active subscription. To get a more concise view, you can send the output from the Get As resource group to the format table control using a pipe. The output looks something like this. Create a resource group. As you know, when you're creating resources in Azure, you always place them into a resource group for management purposes. A resource group is often one of the first things you create when starting a new application. You can create resource groups by using the new Azure resource group control. You must specify a name and location. The name must be unique within your subscription. The location determines where the metadata for your resource group is stored, which may be important to you for compliance reasons. You use strings like West US, North Europe, or West India to specify the location. As with most of the Azure controls, new Azure resource group has many optional parameters. However, the core syntax is Remember, we will be working in an active Azure sandbox, which creates the resource group for you. Use the previous command if you prefer to work in your own subscription. Verify the resources. The Get As resource lists your Azure resources, which is useful here to verify the resources were created and the resource group creation was successful. Like the get Azure as a group command, you can get a more concise view through the format table condolt. You can also filter it to specific resource groups to only list resources associated with that group. Create an Azure virtual machine. Another common task you can do with PowerShell is to create VMs. Azure PowerShell provides the new ASVM condolt to create a virtual machine. The condolt has many parameters to let it handle the large number of VM configuration settings. Most of the parameters have reasonable default values, so we only need to specify 5 things: resource group name, the resource group into which the new VM should be placed; name, the name of the VM in Azure; location, geographic location where the VM should be provisioned; credential, an object containing the username and password for the VM admin account. We use the get credential condolt. This condolt prompts for a username and password and packages it into a credential object. Image, the operating system image to use for the VM, which is typically a Linux distribution or Windows server. You can supply these parameters directly to the condolt as shown in the previous example. Alternatively, you can use other condolts to configure the virtual machine, such as set ASVM operating system, set ASVM source image, add ASVM network interface, and set ASVM disk. Here's an example that strings the get credential condolt together with the credential parameter. Here's an example that strings the get credential condolt together with the credential parameter. The azvm suffix is specific to VM-based commands in PowerShell. There are several others you can use. Example, getting information for a VM. You can list the VMs in your subscription using the get ASVM status command. This command also supports entering a specific VM by including the name property. Here, we assign it to a PowerShell variable. The interesting thing is that now your VM is an object with which you can interact. For example, you can make changes to that object, then push changes back to Azure by using the update ASVM command. The interactive mode in PowerShell is appropriate for one-off tasks. In our example, we use the same resource group for the lifetime of the project, so creating it interactively is reasonable. Interactive mode is often quicker and easier for this task than writing a script and executing that script exactly once. Recall our original scenario, creating VMs to test our CRM software. When a new build is available, we want to spin up a new VM so we can test the full install experience from a clean image. When we're finished, we want to delete the VM. Let's try the commands you would use to create a VM. Create a Linux VM with Azure PowerShell. Because we're using the Azure Sandbox, you won't have to create a resource group. Instead, use the resource group, Sandbox resource group name. In addition, be aware of the location restrictions. Let's create a new Azure VM with PowerShell. Use the new ASVM command to create a VM. Use the resource group learn9ddc3bf6E15644019550BD0B70C73DFF. Give the VM a name. Typically, you want to use something meaningful that identifies the purposes of the VM, location, and, if there's more than one, instance number. We'll use test-VM use01 for test VM in East US, instance 1. Come up with your own name based on where you'll place the VM. Select a location close to you from the following list, available in the Azure Sandbox. Make sure to change the value in the following example command if you're using copy and paste. Use canonical 0001 com Ubuntu server focal 20_04 LTS latest for the image. This image is Ubuntu Linux. Use the get credential command and feed the results into the credential parameter. See the Linux VM FAQ for username and password limitations. Passwords must be 12 to 123 characters in length, and meet 3 of the following 4 complexity requirements. You can use the copy button to copy commands to the create a username and password, then press enter. PowerShell will start creating your VM. The VM creation takes a few minutes to complete. After completion, you can query it and assign the VM object to a variable, $VM. You can reach into complex objects through a dot notation. For example, to see the properties in the VM size object associated with the hardware profile section, run the following command. With the IP address, you can connect to the VM with SSH. For example, if you used the username Bob, and the IP address is 205.22.16.5, running this command would connect to the Linux machine. To try out some more commands, let's delete the VM. We'll shut it down first. The remove asvm command just deletes the VM. It doesn't clean up any of the other resources. At this point, we'd likely just delete the resource group itself and be done with it. However, let's run through the exercise to clean it up manually. You should see a pattern in the commands. Delete the network interface. We should have caught all the created resources. Check the resource group just to be sure. We performed many manual commands here, but a better approach would have been to write a script. Then we could reuse this logic later to create or delete a VM. Let's look at scripting with PowerShell. Create and save scripts in Azure. PowerShell completed 100 XP. 10 minutes. Complex or repetitive tasks often take a great deal of administrative time. Organizations prefer to automate these tasks to reduce costs and avoid errors. Automation is important in the customer relationship management, CRM, company example. There, you're testing your software on multiple Linux virtual machines, VMs, that you need to continuously delete and recreate. You want to use a PowerShell script to automate the creation of the VMs versus creating them manually each time. Beyond the core operation of creating a VM, you have a few more requirements for your script. You'll create multiple VMs, so you want to put the creation inside a loop. You need to create VMs in 3 different resource groups, so the name of the resource group should be passed to the script as a parameter. In this section, you'll see how to write and execute an Azure PowerShell script that meets these requirements. What is a PowerShell script? A PowerShell script is a text file containing commands and control constructs. The commands are invocations of commands. The control constructs are programming features like loops, variables, parameters, comments, etc., supplied by PowerShell. PowerShell script files have a .ps1 file extension. You can create and save these files with any text editor. Tip: if you're writing PowerShell scripts under Windows, you can use the Windows PowerShell Integrated Scripting Environment, ISE. This editor provides features such as syntax coloring and a list of available commands. The following screenshot shows the Windows PowerShell Integrated Scripting Environment, ISE, with a sample script to connect to Azure and create a virtual machine in Azure. Once you've written the script, execute it from the PowerShell command line by passing the name of the file preceded by a dot and a backslash. PowerShell techniques. PowerShell has many features found in typical programming languages. You can define variables, use branches and loops, capture command line parameters, write functions, add comments, and so on. We'll need 3 features for our script: variables, loops, and parameters. In the last unit, you saw that PowerShell supports variables. Use $$ to declare a variable and equals to assign a value. For example, variables can hold objects. For example, the following definition sets the admin credential variable to the object returned by the getCredential. To obtain the value stored in a variable, use the $ prefix and its name, as in the following. Loops. PowerShell has several loop structures, including for, do, while, and for, each. The for loop is the best match for our needs because we'll execute a command a fixed number of times. The following example shows the core syntax. The example runs for 2 iterations and prints the value of I each time. The comparison operators are written lt for less than, l for less than or equal, ik for equal, ne for not equal, etc. When you execute a script, you can pass arguments on the command line. You can provide names for each parameter to help the script extract the values. For example, we could take these parameters as input and use a loop to create a set of VMs from the given parameters. We'll try that next. The combination of PowerShell and Azure. PowerShell gives you all the tools you need to automate Azure. In our CRM example, we'll be able to create multiple Linux VMs using a parameter to keep the script generic and a loop to avoid repeated code. This script allows us to execute a formally complex operation in a single step. In this unit, you'll continue with the example of a company that makes Linux admin tools. Recall that you plan to use Linux VMs to let potential customers test your software. You have a resource group ready, and now it's time to create the VMs. Your company has paid for a booth at a large Linux trade show. You plan a demo area containing 3 terminals each connected to a separate Linux VM. At the end of each day, you want to delete the VMs and recreate them, so they start fresh every morning. Creating the VMs manually after work when you're tired would be error-prone. You want to write a PowerShell script to automate the VM creation process. Note: normally, you'd have to authenticate with Azure using your credentials using Connect Azure account, and you could do so in the script. However, in Cloud Shell environment you will already be authenticated, so this is unnecessary. The script will take several minutes to complete. When it's finished, verify it ran successfully by looking at the resources you now have in your resource group. You should see 3 VMs, each with a unique name. You wrote a script that automated the creation of 3 VMs in the resource group indicated by a script parameter. The script is short and simple, but automates a process that would take a long time to complete manually with the Azure portal. Summary 200 XP 3 minutes. In this module, we wrote a script to automate the creation of multiple VMs. Even though the script was relatively short, you can see the potential power when you combine loops, variables, and functions from PowerShell with concerts from Azure PowerShell. Azure PowerShell is a good automation choice for admins with PowerShell experience. The combination of clean syntax and a powerful scripting language also makes it worth considering even if you're new to PowerShell. This level of automation for time-consuming and error-prone tasks should help you reduce administrative time and increase quality. 1. True or false? The Azure Portal, the Azure CLI, and Azure PowerShell offer significantly different services, so it's unlikely that all 3 will support the operation you need. Suppose you're building a video editing application that will offer online storage for user-generated video content. You'll store the videos in Azure Blobs, so you need to create an Azure storage account to contain the blobs. Once the storage account is in place, it's unlikely you would remove and recreate it because all the user videos would be deleted. Which tool is likely to offer the quickest and easiest way to create the storage account? What needs to be installed on your machine to let you execute Azure PowerShell concerts locally? What needs to be installed on your machine to let you execute Azure PowerShell concerts locally?